Do any other members seek recognition to speak on the resolution? Mr. Sears.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. But the recent, where am I? I'm more discombobulated here, Chairman. The reason we're here today is simple. President Trump stood next to Vladimir Putin and took his side over the American people in our Intelligence Committee. He let Putin lie and say Russia did not hack our elections. In my eyes, he stood on stage with Putin and failed to defend someone who is committed to destroying this country. He took a private meeting with Putin with no aides present. We still don't know what happened in that meeting. The American people deserve to know what our president said to one of our adversaries. It is unacceptable that the administration continues to cozy up to the Russians at the expense of our security and safety. We were sent here to conduct oversight of the administration's policies, and we deserve to know what the president and Putin discuss. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other members seek recognition? Any other members seek recognition to speak? Do any members seek recognition? Mr. Cecilini.
Yes. Move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I support House Resolution 1017, which requests that the administration turn over documents related to the July 16th meeting between President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin. 2 months after the fact, Congress and the American people still know nothing or next to nothing about what was discussed between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin in a private 2-hour meeting in which none of the president's advisors were present. After that meeting, President Trump stood on a stage with Vladimir Putin, a man who directed his military to launch a cyber attack on our country's elections and whose regime regularly has journalists murdered, LGBT individuals tortured, and political opponents thrown into jail. Rather than standing up to President Putin, President Trump bent over backwards to appease a dictator and even defended Putin while denigrating our FBI, our intelligence officials, and anyone who wants to see Putin held accountable for his actions. This was an incredibly embarrassing and sad day for America. Based on the president's own words, here's what we know about what took place in the meeting. The two had, I quote, a direct, open, deeply productive dialogue and spoke on a wide range of critical issues for both of our countries, end quote. The president believed Putin when he told him that it was not Russia that interfered in the 2016 elections, regardless of the fact that the U.S. intelligence community has, without a doubt, identified Russia as the source of the attack. He has since walked back this stance after widespread outrage and the mountains of clear evidence to the contrary of his claims. The president also apparently considered Putin's incredible offer, as he called it, to allow Russians to question ambassadors and employees of the United States intelligence community. He walked this back, too, after even his own advisors were incredulous at this absolutely nonsensical and dangerous proposal. Substantively, most of what we know about the meeting has come from the Russian government. A Russian major general was reported to have said that the Russian Ministry of Defense is ready for practical implementation of international security agreements reached between Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump at the Helsinki summit. Despite this committee's repeated requests, the administration still hasn't told the American people or this committee anything substantive about the meeting in Helsinki, and certainly nothing about these alleged international security agreements. This committee has the constitutional authority and responsibility to conduct oversight and get answers. The administration's lack of transparency about what was said and agreed to is particularly disturbing in light of the ongoing investigation into the Trump campaign's ties to Russia, which has so far produced nearly 200 criminal charges in active indictments or to which individuals have already pled guilty. Vladimir Putin is not a friend of the United States or the American people. He's a brutal dictator whose repressive values are completely contrary to our own. Given how little we know about what transpired in Helsinki, how can we trust that the president didn't offer, purposely or otherwise, sensitive information that could put our citizens, soldiers, or allies in danger? How can we trust that the president didn't commit the United States to actions or agreements that may be against our nation's interests? And given that we still don't know the details relating to Russia's involvement in the election of the president, how can we trust that what was discussed between President Trump and his admitted supporter, Vladimir Putin, didn't compromise the president's ability to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against our enemies? These are basic questions that are absolutely critical to our understanding of the administration's policies towards Russia. We have an obligation as the Committee of Jurisdiction over Foreign Affairs to conduct proper oversight of the administration's actions and policies vis-a-vis Russia. I can't imagine what reason my colleagues could possibly use to justify their unwillingness to support this resolution. All it does is ask for documents that will shed light into this important meeting between President Trump and President Putin and nothing more. This is a basic function of our committee that we should exercise without hesitation and because it is our obligation. So I ask my colleagues to join me in support of this very well-written resolution of inquiry so that we can get to the bottom of this and really provide transparency to the American people so we can really understand what happened during this very consequential meeting and what are the implications for the United States national security and our role in the world. And with that, I yield back.
Any other members seek recognition? Mr. Boyle?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to debate my resolution. It is now 2 months after the Helsinki summit, and we still don't know what was said in the private meeting. The president has not told the American people what he discussed, nor has any administration official come before the committee in an open or even a closed setting to brief us on the important foreign policy matters that were addressed. What we do know is what Donald Trump announced directly following the unprecedented and puzzling one-on-one sit-down. He sowed seeds of doubt regarding the unwavering conclusion of our intelligence community that Russia interfered in our election to the benefit of Mr. Trump, and that Putin used the meeting as a propaganda to boost his stature as a check on American leadership. And we know what else Russia has been up to since. Our national security agencies have confirmed Russia is still working to attack the upcoming 2018 elections. Russia continues to prop up the murderous Assad regime and occupy eastern Ukraine. All of this context fuels important questions regarding the secrecy of this meeting and begs for transparency and congressional oversight. I introduced this resolution in July following the president's damaging and bizarre remarks at the press conference with Putin, following the private sit-down where the president met with Putin without any staff or advisors in the room. This meeting could have profound foreign policy implications, and the president has already built a track record of giving away concessions with nothing in return. Did the president promise any concessions on U.S. sanctions on Russia? The U.S. commitment to NATO? The U.S. non-recognition policy of the Crimea annexation? We simply don't know. But we do know that at the press conference, President Trump said he, quote, spent a great deal of time, close quote, talking about the election and that Putin feels strongly about it and has, quote, an interesting idea. What does that mean? The president fueled doubt and speculation by refusing to say whether he believed the United States intelligence community or the Russian dictator on the subject of election interference in 2016. Trump said that the special counsel's Russia investigation has been a, quote, disaster for the U.S. and has kept America and Russia separated. These comments can be added to a very long list of ways the president has gone out of his way to cozy up to Putin. Now, I wish this resolution weren't necessary, but here we are 60 days after the Helsinki summit, and we still don't know what President Trump said or committed to. We are a co-equal branch of government. Indeed, in the Constitution, we are the first article. The executive is the second. It is time that we take off our red hat or our blue hat and put on our red, white, and blue hat. As fellow Americans and as members of Congress, we have a responsibility to do our jobs. Let's get answers. Let's pass positively this resolution. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. We go to Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I urge support of this important resolution by my colleague, Representative Boyle, that directs the Trump administration to send the House copies of all documents and communications between Trump and Putin during the Helsinki summit. The American people deserve to know the truth of what was discussed, and I want to say with emphasis, Congress has the oversight and authority, duty to demand this information, and it is critical to national security that this Congress not be just a lackey to the executive branch. And yet, the administration has failed to provide any information or come before this committee, as mentioned by my colleagues. And Americans are worried. They are in fear. Why is that? As a candidate, now President Donald Trump refuses to say anything negative about Vladimir Putin. He actually shows admiration for a man who murders his political opponents, meddles in Western democratic elections, suppresses human rights, illegally annexes foreign territory, supports the murderous Assad regime in Syria, and more. And right before the Helsinki summit, President Trump embarrassed our country at NATO, labeling our European allies as foes, then standing at Putin's side in Finland. He parroted Russian propaganda and repeated Putin's lies. When asked directly if he believed Russia interfered in our 2016 elections, he said he didn't see any reason why. I'll tell you why, or what he's ignoring. Number one, our own intelligence community unanimously concluded Russia is meddled in our elections. Number two, the Department of Justice has indicted 25 Russian nationals responsible for the meddling. And number three, Russia has a long, proven history of assaulting Western democracies and using cyber attacks, disinformation, and support for nationalist political groups. Now, here's the thing. We don't have a clue what was discussed in the 2-hour-long private meeting between Trump and Putin. What promises were made? What did they talk about sanctions? What about our election? We have no answers, and the cloud of secrecy is disturbing. We are in fear. It's been reported that they talked about holding a referendum in eastern Ukraine, Iran's presence in Syria, recognition of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, and the future of our nuclear arsenals. And we know Trump himself said it was a wonderful offer when Putin suggested Russian interrogators question American citizens, including a former U.S. ambassador to Russia. Is it possible that the president jeopardized our national security when he was alone in the room with Putin? But without these documents, we may never know. And I just want to conclude by repeating that Congress has the authority and the oversight duty to demand this information that is critical to our national security. I urge we use this responsibility and adopt this resolution. I yield back.
Do any other members seek recognition? Mr. Beeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The camera of history is rolling. We do not live in a time where Congress can just sit back. In fact, we live in extraordinary times. We cannot fool ourselves and say this is ordinary times, because it's not. And history is looking to see what is the United States House of Representatives, what is the Congress going to do to make sure it is utilizing its oversight power of the executive branch, an equal branch of government. And so we cannot pretend that this is a normal circumstance. In fact, a number of my Republican colleagues, especially those that ran for president, not Gregory Meeks, warned us about some of this back during the campaign during that time. I would just refer individuals to the comments of Mr. Romney, who's running for the United States Senate now, Mr. Cruz, who is during that primary period of time, Mr. Rubio, who also had comments about the president at that time, of which I continue to articulate and utilize. So they had some clues that this was not going to be an ordinary circumstance if Mr. Trump was elected. And that's why they said the things that they said during that campaign. And so what has played out is what we've seen to take place at the Helsinki summit, which remains astonishing because for the first time, a U.S. president sat in front of the world stage to undermine their own Department of Justice, their own intelligence community, and invited a foreign adversary to do the same. Without question, this is a troubling moment in our nation's history. When given the chance to forcefully denounce Russia's interference in our elections, President Trump instead parroted Russia's propaganda. Even the administration's latest executive order sanctioning foreign interference in our elections fails to mention Russia by name. This committee's request for documents, records, communications, and even the U.S. translator's notes constitutes not only a moral obligation, but an execution of our constitutionally enshrined right to check and balance the executive branch of government. No other vibrant democracy would accept a meeting between its head of state and a former KGB agent whose primary currency is half-truths and disinformation, and is committed to stirring up discord and division. We need accountability, and we need it today. Unfortunately, we do not trust the administration not to give away key concessions on issues like Crimea, Ukraine, the nuclear nonproliferation. It's unprecedented for staffers, advisors, and technical experts to be excluded from discussions with far-reaching implications for not only the United States, but the entire global community. It is hyperbolic to say Mr. Trump's secretive meeting undermines our national security and abrogates this chamber's ability to perform effective oversight. As public stewards dedicated to transparency and the rule of law, we must keep the executive accountable. It is time for all members of Congress to put their affiliation aside and come together as Americans to address this blatant breach of trust. As the biblical maxim says, a little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. The yeast of secrecy and unaccountability, if left unchecked, will undermine the very foundations of our democracy. The actions of this president is just puzzling. I would have hoped, and if he did, then these transcripts would show that he was talking to the Russians, and should have been, about them being complicit with Syria, for example, in utilizing chemical weapons. He pulled out of an agreement that all had agreed with reference to nuclear weapons, but was there any, with Iran, but was there any conversation in that regard, and what is Russia's role? It seems to me that the American people and all of us here at Congress should know. So I would hope that our Republican colleagues and our public oaths require they demand that we examine the Helsinki events closely, and if not this body, the American people regret not doing so, and history will so record it. And I thank Mr. Boyle for his amendment. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Other members seeking recognition? Congresswoman Norma Torres.
Thank you, Chairman Royce. H.R. 1017 is an important measure, and I thank my colleague, Congressman Boyle, for introducing it, and also want to thank Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for bringing it before this committee. H.R. 1017 would force the administration to turn over documents related to the July 16 meeting that took place between President Trump and Vladimir Putin in Helsinki. As I recall, Democrats were not the only ones with very serious questions about that meeting or concerns. As I recall, many of my Republican colleagues were shocked at the fact that President Trump would meet with Putin with no staff, and shocked by the bizarre spectacle of a joint conference in which President Trump treated Putin like a friend, not the adversary that he is. He is not our friend, and let us be clear about that. Russia is not our ally. As we discussed in this morning's hearing, Russia is a subject to multiple U.S. sanctions for its many malign activities. The United States has sanctioned Russia for corruption, for interfering in our elections, for invading Crimea, for using chemical weapons to poison a former spy in the UK. And I won't go into the long and sordid history of President Trump's relationship with Russia. I won't go into the many examples of President Trump's campaign officials' ties to Russia, or the administration officials' ties to Russia in general. There is an ongoing investigation, and we must allow that investigation to run its course. But I will say that there are some serious questions about the Helsinki meeting, and the American people deserve to know. I hope that today that we can rise above party politics and bring some much-needed transparency to this disturbing episode. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Do any other members seek recognition? Seeing no further requests for recognition to speak, the question occurs on the pending motion of the chair to report the resolution adversely. The chair orders a recorded vote, as I stated at the outset, to give all our members a fair opportunity to participate. We are going to take a brief recess, and then we reconvene to vote at 1:50? 1:50. The committee stands in recess.
That's in 10 minutes.
Did you want an unrecorded vote? I didn't think so I thought
Do you want to go see the parliamentarians quickly, or do you want to wait till after the vote and see them?
Which
This is
parliamentarian?
the Indian parliamentarians that you guys are supposed to see at 1:30.
Ed 2?
Yeah. So Mr. Yoho's up there right now. I told him to come here when they're done. 1:30. 1:30. Yeah. I told him to. Okay, so they're up there right now, and
Yeah, I think they are.
I can go get them and bring them down here. They're in 2200. I think Mr. Yoho is meeting with them now.
We've got between now and 1:50. I guess we could go up there.
Or bring them down
I can,
here
I can,
to the
yeah, I can bring them
Why
down.
not bring them down? It's easier for us.
Yeah, but tell them that we have like
Yeah, so
10
they-
minutes, 5 minutes.
Yeah, they know. They know. I already sort of mentioned to them.
Okay, this committee will come back to order. When we recessed, we had
Chairman?
concluded debate.
Mr. Chairman, move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this week, legendary journalist Bob Woodward released a book with disturbing details about what's going on in the White House. White House Chief of Staff General Kelly reportedly said President Trump has gone off the rails. We're in crazy town. I don't even know why any of us are here. And General Kelly denied some of the comments attributed to him, and Woodward is standing by his reporting. Either way, the question it raises is a good one. Why are any of us here? Why are any of us up here on this dais? Are we taking our duty to our constituents seriously? Are we living up to Article 1 of the Constitution? This is the people's house. We are the American people's check on power, check on the administration, their oversight of the White House. Are we going to take that job seriously? In July, I'm sure many of you were as dumbfounded as I was when we saw the President of the United States stand side by side with Russian President Vladimir Putin. He undermined the conclusions of American intelligence agencies, the agencies made up of hardworking, patriotic Americans who sacrifice so much and go out into the most dangerous situations to gather information to keep our country safe. The conclusions in their report have been publicly available since January of 2017. President Trump pretended they didn't exist. He ignored the American lives that were on the line to create it. In fact, there are rumors that he considered Putin's request to allow questioning of some of those very U.S. officials. But once again, we don't know where the truth lies because the only people in the room were Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. I don't know about you. That's not what I expect of my president. I expect strength in the face of Russian aggression. I don't expect our president to blame America when Russia invaded its neighbors, when it used nerve gas against agents in Britain, when it attacked the foundation of our democracy. If history teaches anything, it teaches that simple-minded appeasement or wishful thinking about our adversaries is folly. It means the betrayal of our past, the squandering of our freedom. That's how President Reagan said it in 1983. That is a statement with principles at its foundation and our dearest American values at its core. You won't hear anything like that coming out of this president's mouth. We cannot be complicit in Donald Trump's abandonment of the principles that used to guide us. And we have a lot of work to do to restore American values. That's the answer to the question, why are we even here? I urge my colleagues who have now returned to this hearing room to oppose the motion to report the resolution adversely so that we can move forward with Mr. Boyle's resolution and advance this committee's responsibility to protect our democracy by pursuing the truth. And I'm glad to yield to my friend, Mr. Connolly.
I thank my friend, and I thank him for his eloquence and for setting the parameters of what ought to be a fruitful discussion. I plead with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. This committee has, by and large, seen and heard no evil when it comes to this president, even as he talks down alliances, even as he caters and panders to Vladimir Putin at the summit, even when he trashes our allies in the G7, even when he rips up agreements that disrupt long-term friendships and relationships, even when he deplores the EU and says the NATO, our longest alliance that worked so well and still does, is obsolete. Is there any line he can cross that might merit your ire? This resolution, allowed to come to the floor without a recommendation, would be something then the House of Representatives, the people's body, could debate, and fruitfully so. Or are we today, once again, simply going to vote along party lines to protect and defend the indefensible in foreign policy, and once again shirk our duty as the Committee of Jurisdiction and Cognizance to protect the foreign interests of the United States of America, even when that means we cross the executive? I hope we think long and hard about our action today, and I thank Mr. Boyle for his leadership in this resolution and my friend from Florida for yielding.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I yield back the balance. of my time.
All right. The pending question is on the motion to report House Resolution 1017 adversely. In other words, if you share my opposition to the resolution, you would vote aye. The clerk will call the roll.
Would the chair entertain a parliamentary inquiry first?
I will entertain that inquiry.
I thank the chair. Just a couple of parliamentary inquiries. Is the motion?
Will the gentleman state his inquiry?
Yes, I'm going to ask if the motion is amendable.
It is not at this point. We could consider an alternative motion only if this motion was defeated.
Because I have
The motion before
I have
us
an itsy bitsy change in the adverb from
Well-
adversely to favorably.
Well, we could consider that if this motion fails, but this is the motion before us.
I
Mr.
thank the
Connolly.
chair.
All right, well, thank you. So the pending question, we'll ask the clerk to call the roll.
Mr. Chairman,
Aye.
the chairman votes aye. Mr. Smith? Aye. Mr. Smith votes aye. Ms. Ross-Lehtinen? Aye. Ms. Ross-Lehtinen votes aye. Mr. Rohrabacher? Mr. Rohrabacher votes aye. Mr. Shabbat? Aye. Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Wilson?
Aye.
Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. McCall?
Aye.
Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Poe? Mr. Issa? Mr. Marino? Mr. Marino votes aye. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Cook? Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Perry? Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes aye. Mr. Yoho? Mr. Yoho votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Zeldin? Mr. Zeldin votes aye. Mr. Donovan? Mr. Donovan votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Sensenbrenner votes aye. Ms. Wagner? Ms. Wagner votes aye. Mr. Mast? Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Rooney? Mr. Rooney votes aye. Mr. Fitzpatrick? Mr. Fitzpatrick votes aye. Mr. Garrett?
Aye.
Mr. Garrett votes aye. Mr. Curtis? Mr. Curtis votes aye. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Sherman? Mr. Sherman votes no. Mr. Meeks? Mr. Series? Mr. Series votes no. Mr. Connolly?
Nay.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Bass? Mr. Keating?
No.
Mr. Keating votes no. Mr. Cicilline?
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Barra? Mr. Barra votes no. Ms. Frankel? Ms. Frankel votes no. Ms. Gabbard? Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes no. Mr. Boyle? Mr. Boyle votes no. Ms. Titus? Ms. Titus votes no. Ms. Torres? Ms. Torres votes no. Mr. Schneider? Mr. Schneider votes no. Mr. Swazi? Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. Espaillat? Mr. Espaillat votes no. Mr. Liu? Mr. Liu votes no.
Have all members been recorded? The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 23 ayes and 18 noes.
The motion is adopted, and House Resolution 1017 will be reported adversely. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table, and without objection, staff is directed to make any technical and conforming changes.
Mr. Chairman, I have a
That
unanim-
concludes our business.
I just have a UC request to enter something into the record.
Without it, state the nature of your use.
I have a series of 20 different quotes from members of Congress with respect to the Helsinki performance. I would simply ask unanimous consent they be entered into the record.
Without objection.
I
May I
thank the
ask,
chair.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, may I ask that those, before I decide whether to object, that Mr. Conley read those statements?
I think there will be objection at that point. So might I suggest that
I would ask my friend from Rhode Island to perhaps withdraw his request. Thank the chair.
Very good. I'm trying to be helpful here. That concludes our business. Without objection, the committee is
Mr.
adjourned.
Chairman, oh. Okay. I wanted to mention, it's all right.
Let's go meet.
Yeah, go ahead.